going to hand over to you in a minute, Lena. I'll just give you a little bit of context. We're here in the Brisbane Convention Centre, and we have about 250 people in the audience here, and we're just about to start a panel discussion on what kind of economic growth is permissible in... Sorry? Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot.
Jeremy.
I was talking to Lena, not the audience, Ilka. So you're going to get things going, and I'm not going to say any more other than to mute my microphone, and I'll hand over to you.
Can you just give me a minute, Jeremy?
So you've got about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, but at least when I hear you, your voice is getting disconnected in between. I mean, there are gaps, but can you hear me clearly?
Okay, so I'm going to hand over to you, Lena, and you have about 20 minutes.
Okay. A very good morning to all of you, and also a very good morning to my fellow panelists who are on this session. I am delighted to have this opportunity to talk to all of you on the subject that Jeremy just mentioned, which is what sort of economic growth is permissible in a climate-constrained world. But I do have to speak to that subject from a developing country perspective, because that's what I was asked to do. So in that context, I would definitely say that we would need a very aggressive economic growth model, because we obviously have a lot of catch-up to do. We cannot afford to not focus on growth, because it is a critical pillar of sustainable development, and one that has been projected to be the most aspirational over the last several decades. But having said that, I think if we look at the next part of the title of this particular discussion that we are having, it implies clearly that the economic growth path that we are on today is unacceptable and needs to change. And it needs to change because, as the latest IPCC report has said, not acting on the problem of climate change is going to be disastrous for the world, and it is not really an option that we have. So given that our climate concerns have been increasing rapidly, we do have to do a lot more than we have been doing in the recent past. Again, having said that, I think we also recognize that, or rather, we have feared for a long time that acting on climate mitigation is going to negatively or adversely impact the economic growth opportunities in the world. But again, the Working Group 3 report of the IPCC points out that climate change adaptation is going to cost us a lot more in terms of economic growth than acting on climate mitigation measures. So therefore, I think we do need to act on climate mitigation and have to focus on moving towards zero carbon growth or low carbon growth. But having said that, I also would like to recognize, IPCC and Dr. Pachauri, who's also coincidentally my boss here, and in Terry, says that no part of the world will remain untouched by the impacts of climate change. I think no part of the world is also going to remain untouched by the plight of the vulnerable people in this world. And therefore, it is on both counts that the world needs to act on climate change. But merely saying that we need to move to low carbon or low carbon growth is a rather simplistic interpretation of what is, I think, a very nicely crafted question that Jeremy and his colleagues have put forward to me. That is, how do we respond in terms of a climate-constrained world? Again, from a developing country point of view, I think we have for decades now argued about the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and sometimes we get a little tired when we hear about common but differentiated responsibilities. But what this phrase really does is it recognizes the extremely unequal capacities and capabilities that we have in the world, when looked at both in terms of a bipolar developed and developing world, but also I think when you were to include or differentiate to exclude from this the rapidly emerging countries. I don't think we can claim that all of the rapidly developing countries or emerging countries have the same levels of capabilities and capacities or even similar levels of capabilities and capacities as exist in the developed world. It is merely, I think the term rapidly emerging countries is merely recognizing the potential rather than the reality of these countries. And I do believe that the rapidly emerging countries have a major challenge on this front as well, which is on capabilities and capacities. And to elaborate on that just a wee bit, I think with limited public finances, supporting a transition to low carbon growth competes with meeting urgent developmental needs. And I think there is a trade-off here between enhancing resilience and, of course, mitigation actions. Also, with the large proportion of our businesses still being relatively small and nascent, and I think also most importantly with technology costs actually comparing unfavorably with labor costs in most of these economies and definitely in developing economies, competitive pressures come in the way of efficiency investments in a globalized world. Thirdly, with a high incidence and level of poverty, these prevent the adoption of best available technologies, even though we argue that on a life cycle cost basis, it makes economic sense to invest in the low carbon pathway. So the challenge that we have over here is that on a life cycle basis, we do know that a lot of the choices that we make are economically attractive, but our decisions are made on the basis of first cost. And this applies equally both to the developing world and the developed world. And we haven't found a way of overcoming this challenge of this discrepancy between first costs and life cycle costs in making our choices. For the developing countries, poor progress on financial inclusion and other regulatory systems limits the potential of overcoming the financing barriers that we have in our countries. And the other major challenge of the developing countries that I would like to focus your attention on is the fact that we have actually still pretty weak educational systems that are trying to cope with huge faculty challenges and a large uneducated or illiterate population. And we would find it extremely challenging to respond to the needs of the transformational changes that we require to move through low carbon pathways. So I think not only would the developing countries need more time and space to engage more pervasively with the transition to a low carbon world, but would also need more support and access to affordable technology. Again, an argument that has been put forward for the last several decades, but it is definitely not passé in my view. Having said all of that, I think the world has already focused a lot on these challenges and on the costs of moving to a low carbon pathway, and we are all very familiar with this. The recognition of vulnerabilities from committed climate change exacerbated by what I might say is willful inaction in the last 2 decades, and the distribution pattern bring a focus on the inequity and injustice of the current economic order that we have, both within and across generations. And I think it should force us to focus or rethink on patterns and policies of our future economic growth. So I'll use the opportunity that this session provides me to spend a little time on 2 aspects of this rethinking. One is on the characteristics and drivers of economic growth as we have seen in the past. And the second is the opportunities that a carbon-constrained world provides us in looking at economic growth for the future. To spend just a couple of minutes on characteristics of economic growth, I think this is important when we are looking at future economic growth. What we have done in the past is that we have focused on building bigger and more. We have focused on extracting more and faster. We have seen a concentration of power of production capacities. We have established leadership through technological and if I may say again, military might rather than on environmental and planetary factors. We have allowed democracy to be redefined in the interest of a people. This, I think, these characteristics go against what we are talking about as being permissible for the future. And to illustrate some of these views that I have on this subject, just a couple of quick statistics. I think, the rock drilling capacity that we have in the world has increased from less than 50 meters per hour in the 1960s to over 450 meters per hour in early 2000s. 900% increase in the 40 years that we are talking about. And again, just for purposes of comparison, the population increase that we have seen in this period is about 233%. So, technology has definitely made a big difference to us, both on the positive side as well as on the negative side. Similarly, I think if you look at unit sizes of thermal power plants, these were a mere 5 to 10 megawatts in the early 2000s, and today we have huge capacities that we are talking about, depending on whether we are talking about coal thermal or nuclear power plants. Thermal efficiencies have also improved from less than about 20% to about 40%, and of course significantly higher in the current day modern both thermal and nuclear power plants. But what all of this has done for us is that it has resulted in lower costs and higher consumption, and has led to a growth model that focuses on grow and build strategy. So earlier we consumed to meet our needs, but today our consumption is driven by a need created by industry, which feels compelled to grow in turn. So the growth itself and our consumption needs are not necessarily what we are consuming, as what Gandhiji said, we have enough to meet our needs, but not to meet our greed. So I think we have left that concept way behind. And to some extent, we are being driven by the need of industry to grow, and that's what our consumption is driven by. I don't mean to say that technology is not good for society or not good for humanity. I think we have often heard this refrain that we cannot go back to being cavemen, and yes, I definitely don't mean to say that. Technology has improved our lives and will continue to improve our lives, undoubtedly. However, I think what I'm pointing towards is the fact that technology has or cannot be allowed to take over our lives, and it should be regulated so that we use it effectively and to our common good, and not just in this generation, but also for future generations. And sustainability has definitely to be kept in mind as we go along. I think we also need to understand that technology does not work in a vacuum. It is a means to exploit resources. It also needs to be seen in combination with the fact that technology today is being used to exploit resources, both in ground and above ground, and that an inadequate pricing of these natural resources has actually been the first subsidies that we have provided to industry when we look at our historical growth. And it is for this reason that we see and we hear a lot about the inequity and injustice that we have in today's world. Economic growth has become, and we have allowed it to become, a monster that feeds off itself. You need people with high incomes purchasing goods and services that create more incomes, and this cycle goes on, but it leaves behind those that are outpriced in the economy or economic growth pattern that we have today. So with that, again, as the background, I would say that one of the potentially biggest mistakes that we can make in seeking economic growth opportunities in the future is to limit our attention on large climate fixed technologies, and we are doing that to some extent. Focusing our attention on large climate fixed technologies will further exacerbate the cycle of build big, consume more, and concentrate wealth further. And this is not going to be able to sustain a humanitarian or a system where even the poor have many more aspirations, are much better informed, and can see the inequalities that we have in the world today. So what are the opportunities as we are going forward? I think technology has to be put in the service of the masses and not just of the classes. Economic growth needs to be widened and made more inclusive. Consumption must be shifted from more consumption by the have-nots rather than to more consumption by the haves. And governments need to reclaim their authority on defining patterns of development. Once again, I'm not saying that we need to become, need to go back to the public sector driven model. The private sector has a huge amount to contribute and they bring in a lot of efficiencies, but governments have to perform their regulatory function much better than they have done in the past and in a much more accountable manner. So these are a few things that I did want to highlight in my intervention. But I think in concluding some of the remarks that I wanted to make, we do need more diverse models that would allow the developing countries to not lag behind in their contributions to a low carbon growth path, but they need to have a much more inclusive development. India, for example, has had this as a rhetoric for some time, and we are trying to act on this, but not necessarily as successfully as we would have liked. We need many more decentralized solutions. Technology is definitely allowing us that option, but I don't think that our policy and economic models have really focused on how we can exploit the decentralized technologies that have a lower footprint but are much more inclusive in terms of growth. So therefore, we need to focus a lot more on the policy mechanisms and choices and not just on the technological solutions that are available to the world. We need many more innovations in financing models that will also address the issue of providing risk support when we are looking at these new models of development. And we need to focus, therefore, on a much wider array of solutions that are available to this world. The developing countries, again, in international negotiations, speak about capacities and capabilities. When we undertook an exercise to look at what are the choices that are available to developing countries, we found a big mismatch between what governments in developing countries and what opinion makers in developing countries recognize as win-win solutions that will match energy security, that will match a low carbon growth pathway, and that will match the inclusive development that I was talking about, and what they are actually pursuing as strategies for meeting their energy security. So this particular finding also highlights the fact that even governments in a number of developing countries probably feel constrained in being able to define these policy pathways that would allow us to move to low carbon growth. We are very comfortable with the large centralized power generating systems which are grid-based. Our human capacities are oriented towards meeting the needs of this particular industry. We do not know how to deal with the variabilities when we talk about moving to much more renewables. And India, as an example, as a country, has a huge renewable energy potential. We have large solar capacities, we have fairly good wind energy capacities, we have a lot of biomass, and I think we know that about 3 billion people in the world today still use biomass to a very large extent to meet their energy requirements, but we haven't learned how to harness these decentralized distributed capacities and still provide the 24/7 convenient to use power and energy sources that the entire world, even the poor, aspire towards. We still do not know how to make the most sophisticated technologies that are today available that have a lower environmental and carbon footprint available to those who are not able to afford it in the first instance. We still do not know how to service these technologies in remote rural areas, and we are not able to exploit the employment potential that exists when we look at some of these solutions. So I think in sum, what I'm trying to say is that we know that there are technological solutions that are available, This is also obvious in the fact that there is a huge gap between best available technologies that we have even today and the ones that are currently in use in a large part of the world. And this gap is something that we have not learned how to bridge. What we are doing is we are investing in newer and better technologies, but we are increasing the gap between those best available technologies and what we have in the field today. We do know that we have the economic choices, that it is cheaper for us to move to these best available and potentially better available technologies of the future, but we have not been able to define the policies, mechanisms, the regulatory systems, and we probably don't have the institutional capacities that would allow us to make this transition to these better technologies which are more economically viable. So my appeal, my request to the world community would be that we need to focus a little bit on not just the technological solutions, not just the fact that the economies work, but on building these capabilities and capacities that are a huge challenge, definitely in the developing world. So, Jeremy, back to you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity once again.
Lena, thank you very much indeed for that presentation. I think it's given us plenty of food for thought, and I'm sure the panelists in this next session will be making reference to some of the points you've raised. So we'll say goodbye to you now. Thank you very much, and it's very early there in New Delhi, so maybe you can go and have some breakfast now.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, now I can relax because we're not going to use any more technology, at least the sort that requires dialing people the other side of the world. Let me introduce the panel for this next session, which again is a star-studded cast. I'll just introduce them briefly, and then I'll ask them to come and join me on the stage here. We have Jean Palutikof joining us. She is the director of the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, NCARF, based at Griffith University on the Gold Coast. She is a review editor for the APCSE 5th Assessment Report, Working Group 2, which I think would be good for us to hear about what she has to say in that regard. She's also worked on previous assessment reviews, namely the 4th one, when she was based at the UK Met Office. Her research interests lie in the area of climate change policy, impact and adaptation. We also have one of Australia's best-known public intellectuals in Clive Hamilton. He's author, currently Professor of Public Ethics at the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics, a joint operation between Charles Sturt and the University of Melbourne. He is well known, of course, for his directorship, the executive directorship of the Australia Institute, which he founded and then headed up for 14 years, no less. And he's published on a wide range of subjects. I'll mention a few of the books here, most of which I've read, I have to say. Growth Fetish, Scorcher, Requiem for a Species, and most recently, Earth Masters, The Dawn of the Age of Climate Engineering, which I'm about halfway through at the moment, but I have to put down because it's a little bit too depressing. But a jolly good read nevertheless. We have Ian Dunlop with us. He's Again, becoming quite a media personality these days. He's very well experienced in international business, particularly in the energy sector. He has been one-time chair of the Australian Coal Association. He's currently chairman of Safe Climate Australia, a director of Australia 21, deputy convener of the Australian Association for the Study of Peak Oil. He's a member of the Club of Rome, to just mention a few of these things. But I do want to make mention of the fact that he is running again to be a member of the BHP board on the platform of climate change. Brian Czech has joined us from the United States. Brian is best known for a lot of work he's done on the steady state economy. He's extremely well published in this area, and he's the most recent author of Supply Shock, which hopefully he'll talk a little bit about today. Supply Shock, Economic Growth at the Crossroads. It was published late last year. He's also well known for another book, which some of you may have read, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, which he calls for an end to economic growth. But he's here in Australia. He spoke last week on a conference staged by the Fenner School. He was staged in Sydney. Conference was Addicted to Growth, and we've let them pay for him to fly from the United States to Australia, and we've paid for him to fly from Sydney to Brisbane. So we worked that quite well. So could I ask the 4 panelists to come and join me on the stage, please? Give them a hand. So the format for this session is slightly different in that we have each of the speakers giving an opening presentation of a few slides, and I figured it would probably be best to start with Jean Palutikof, not least because if we're going to address this question of what sort of economic growth is permissible in a climate-constrained world, it would be kind of handy to have someone talk about the latest state of play in terms of climate science, and who better than Jean, given her connection with the APCSE. So would you like to just step up here, James? I think it's probably best, particularly if you've got the screen behind you here. And we need to get my computer up there. Okay, Jean.
So thank you, and thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak. I'm actually not going to talk about the science today. I will touch on it, but I thought the audience that we have here today might be a little bit more relevant to just talk about what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is and where it sits in the scheme of things, and whether or not, given all the concerns around global change and so forth, it remains as a relevant and useful organisation to support us in thinking about where we're heading for and whether or not that's a good place to be heading for. So I'm just going to spend a few moments talking about the IPCC. It stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we all cite it a lot. Whenever we're looking for something to support an argument around climate change, we go to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It has become the sort of respected, authoritative voice around climate change. So what is it? Well, it's not a bunch of scientists who got up one morning and thought, oh, it's a really good idea, let's go and write an assessment. It's actually a carefully constructed body put together, as you might tell from the name, by governments through the United Nations, in particular the WMO and UNEP to assess the science around climate change and to deliver that assessment to support the negotiations that the governments are undertaking around limiting emissions and supporting adaptation in developing countries. So it brings together a lot of scientists, and this just gives you some idea of the scale of the most recent assessment, which is the 5th. 3 working groups come and deliver an assessment each. This just gives you the numbers for the 2nd working group, which deals with impacts, adaptation and vulnerability. Gives you some idea of the scale. 308 authors, 70 countries, 50,492 review comments that they have to deal with. And that is to produce just one assessment. It's been going since about 1980. As you can see, it's currently on its 5th assessment. Each assessment takes of the order of 5 to 6 years to produce. And one of the reasons for that is this very complex process of review, which actually goes through 4 drafts of each chapter, each of which is reviewed by experts and by governments. So its role is, and this is a sort of mantra for the IPCC and everyone who works for it, that it should be policy relevant but never policy prescriptive. It's pretty unique in that it brings together scientists and governments in order to arrive at an agreed position on what the science is telling us about climate change. And it does this through what is called an approval meeting. So having gone through all these numerous cycles of review, it distills the enormous document, which I had a look at the Working Group 1 printed version of the 5th assessment last week. It runs to 1,500 pages. And that gets boiled down into something called a summary for policymakers, which is about 15 pages. So that, as you can imagine, is a bit of an ordeal in itself. And those 15 pages, a draft version, is taken to an approval meeting. And at the approval meeting, all governments who sit on the Intergovernmental Panel, which is in fact all governments which are members of the WMO and UNEP, which is essentially everybody, come to the approval meeting and they assess on a line-by-line basis each fragment of the summary for policymakers. And at the end of a working week, which usually involves several all-night sessions, they end up with a 15-page document of approved text. And the reason why that's a good thing, we'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, is that IPCC works on a consensus basis. So all the governments will have bought into the text which is approved, which means that when they go to the international negotiations, which take place at the Conference of the Parties, which is in November, and this year will be in Lima. When they go to these meetings, the negotiations take place within a framework of an agreed position on the science. So the governments can't suddenly turn around in Lima and say, actually, I don't believe a word of this, climate change is nonsense. They can't do that because they've actually approved a summary for policymakers, which this time says that human-induced warming is unequivocal. So that's a great strength and a great purpose of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So other things that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change does, which I think are valuable, is that it brings to a wider public key findings around climate change, which we can use for a basis for concern, as a basis for pushing for action, as a basis for seeking to persuade governments that there is a necessity to do something around climate change. And you'll have heard that word unequivocal used by the IPCC. That finding that human-induced warming is unequivocal has become something which is used very widely by civil society to push governments to take action. This is another one from Working Group 2, which appears in the current, the 5th assessment, which looks at, on the right-hand side, key risks, for example, to ecosystems or changing frequency of extreme events. And it relates those key risks and the extent to which they are becoming more severe as a result of climate change to temperature increases, so you see the thermometer bar on the right, and to timing. So you can look at this figure with respect to when will things become very severe. You can also look at them with respect to how much temperature increase is required to make this risk to a particular thing, such as ecosystems, more severe. Or you can look at it with respect to the different pathways of warming. If we limit our emissions effectively and follow the blue line, you can see that the risks will become much less severe than if we carry on as we do at the present time, which is following the red bar, and risks to ecosystems, for example, will become much more severe than they are at the present time, and what the governments like to call dangerous, although the definition of dangerous is a little bit unclear, when warming goes for about another 0.5 degree, round about the middle of the present century. So that's another contribution of the IPCC. But I just wanted to put up this slide because this takes you through the strengths and weaknesses of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It has this rigorous review process, which gives it a good reputation, but also means that it's slow to carry out an assessment. It has the approval process, which means that all governments are bought in, but nevertheless, it is the case that the science can be watered down. It's no more or no less than an assessment. People widely perceive it as being much more than an assessment, but it's not. That's all it does. It takes existing science and it assesses it, which means that governments perceive it as rather unthreatening. And each assessment is largely freestanding, which means that it doesn't gather the clutter which institutions tend to over time, but nevertheless it lacks a corporate entity. So that memory. So that brings me round to the place where I began, which is the IPCC still relevant? Is it still useful, or do we need to find another way to do things? Well, I think the bottom line is, if we consider it not to be useful and not to be relevant, then we have to question whether or not the multinational, multilateral negotiations that take place around climate change under the auspices of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, whether or not there is still a role for those multilateral negotiations. And I think that is a conversation that we do need to have, given the failure in Copenhagen and given the singular lack of progress that has taken place subsequently. There are great hopes for the Conference of the Party, which will take place in Paris at the end of 2015, but there is no certainty around that. So I think, is the IPCC still relevant is actually wrapped up in this much larger question of around whether multilateral negotiations on climate change are still relevant. Are we actually getting anywhere, or are we fooling ourselves, and do we need a better way to do it? I do think that the Intergovernmental Panel does need to consider whether the rather slow and clunky reports that it produces every 5 to 6 years, they are the go-to place for reliable and authentic statements on climate change, but nevertheless they do take a long time, and they are always slightly behind the latest science. Because of this rather elaborate process that the assessments have to go through, they are a little bit slow. So we do have to consider whether there is a faster, shorter, more focused role for the IPCC than the one that it currently undertakes. So actually, being the first speaker, I would just like to leave two questions on the table. One of them I've just already dealt with, which is the multilateral negotiation process around climate change dead, or does it have a future? Do we have to find another way? But I think another question that we all need to face, and I think that Lina Srivastava did touch on, although I think she managed not actually to mention the word, which is, can we do this without resorting to nuclear power? And I do think that this is a question that we do tend as a community to shy away from, we don't engage with, but I do think it's one that we need to consider. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I was wondering how long it would be before nuclear power came up. I know Jeffrey Sachs mentioned it fleetingly as well, so maybe we'll get the panel to comment on this. I think based on the kind of work that's been done by the APCSE, we're pretty clear now on, I mean, the science is in, you know, we have the data, and then you've got the likes of Carbon Tracker and so forth have figured out how much more carbon we can emit vis-a-vis the reserves we have globally, both in public and private hands. And I think it'd be a good opportunity now to ask Clive Hamilton to come up and talk about carbon budgets, not least because I know he's been involved in this work with the Climate Change Authority. So Clive, would you like to come up?
Thanks very much, Jeremy, for that intro. Yes, I'm a member of the Climate Change Authority, which everybody confuses that vaguely. Isn't that the Climate Change Commission didn't get abolished? No. The Climate Change Authority was established as part of the package of clean energy legislation that the Labor and Greens introduced, which established the carbon price and a whole bunch of other things. And it was established as the principal independent advisory authority on climate change policy in Australia. And although the Abbott government desperately wishes to abolish it, it still exists because the Senate will not pass legislation to abolish the authority. And today I want to talk about what I regard as a very important report that the authority issued at the start of this year, which was titled the Targets and Progress Review, fairly dull title, but with some extremely important analysis in it. And like all nations, Australia has declared its commitment to limit global warming to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. And such a commitment imposes a limit on the volume of greenhouse gases that can be emitted over time, because warming is associated not with annual emissions, it doesn't get hotter because we emitted more emissions this year. Warming is associated with increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, in other words, cumulative emissions. And so this can be illustrated. The arrow button, okay. That one. With this diagram, I'm just wondering, tech people, whether, it might be easier for people. That's right. So this is a kind of a notional paths for a global carbon emission budget. And basically the essential point you need to understand from this is that global warming is a result of the total carbon emissions back to so prior to these curves, back to the Industrial Revolution, say, through to the point when we no longer emit carbon into the atmosphere. And these three notional budgets or trajectories show three possible ways of meeting a given target. So what matters is the area under the curves. That's the cumulative carbon emissions. This is the fundamental thing to understand that most people just still don't get about climate change. It's a cumulative question because each carbon dioxide molecule that goes into the atmosphere as a result of human activity stays there for hundreds and some of it for thousands of years. So it's not a question of, when it gets bad enough, we'll do something about it, which is still the sort of popular view. When it gets bad enough, it will be too late. So cumulative emissions are what matters, the area under the curve. Now, if you've got a fixed amount of emissions over a given period, you can see that there are two crucial factors. One is the year in which, in this case, global emissions reach their peak, their highest level, and then the rate at which they decline thereafter. And it's very apparent, because the areas under these three curves are the same. What's very apparent is that the later the peak, the more rapid must be the emissions reductions thereafter. In other words, it becomes much more difficult the later you leave it. So the peaking year is vital, which is why a lot of people in the greenhouse policy wonky part of the world are taking a lot of notice of what China is saying about the year in which they expect their emissions to peak. It's a really crucial number. The Climate Change Authority has estimated that globally, and drawing on IPCC numbers, we've done this estimate, globally total emissions of 1,700 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent over the period 2000 to 2050 would give the world a 67% chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees. So let me say that again. To have a 67% chance of limiting warming to 2 degrees, then over the period 2000 to 2050, globally, humanity, should not emit more than 1,700 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, you might say, as I indeed did say many times, that the budget should be lower than 1,700 billion tonnes because giving ourselves a 1/3 chance of exceeding 2 degrees is a very high risk given the expected damage of 2 degrees plus of warming, not least the increased likelihood of crossing major tipping points beyond which there would be no going back. Some argue we've already crossed those tipping points with, for example, the melting permafrost. We need a new word. It's no longer permafrost. Now, between 2000 and 2012, the world actually used up 36% of that budget that I just mentioned, 1,700 billion tonnes. So the clock is ticking, and in fact, it's ticking faster each year. So the question is, if the global budget is 1,700 billion tonnes, what would be Australia's fair share? What should Australia's budget be? And that's what the Climate Change Authority set out to do. And first of all, we had to choose a principle for deciding Australia's fair share. How much of the global budget should we be allowed to have? How many of those emissions should Australia emit between now and, say, 2050? And the authority opted for there are a range of equity principles one could use. We adopted what's known as modified contraction and convergence, and that is that there would be global convergence. All countries would converge on equal per capita emissions by 2050, but in the early years, poorer countries would be allowed higher than that in order to give them the opportunity to develop economically with less stringent carbon restrictions. And this fairness principle of modified contraction and convergence led the authority to recommend that Australia should adopt a national emissions budget of 10.1 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent over the period 2013 to 2050. So that's our task. If Australia is to play its fair share, do its fair share in reaching this global attempt to limit warming to 2 degrees, then between now or last year and 2050, Australia should not emit more than 2.1 billion tonnes of CO2e. Now, if we behave prudently, the crucial point about a budget is what we spend of our carbon budget now, we can't spend later. So if we behave prudently now and make stronger efforts to reduce our emissions in the next, say, 10 years, then we will increase our chances of keeping within our budget later on and giving ourselves more options for later. And, of course, we won't be offloading responsibility to the next generation. So what would Australia's budget look like? This is what the authority came up with. So the authority recommends we should reduce our emissions, Australia's emissions, by 15% below 2000 levels by 2020. Bear in mind that the current bipartisan agreed target for 2020 is 5% below 2000 levels. The authority says no, it should be 15% below 2000 levels by 2020, and we should actually add to that another 4%, which is, for complicated reasons, the carryover from the first commitment period. So our actual target would be a 19% reduction below 2000 levels. Now, that 4% carryover basically reflects the fact that Australia came in under its budget or its target for the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. We achieved that not because we did anything, but because the Australian government extracted such an extraordinarily generous deal, essentially by threatening to walk out at the last meeting, at the last moment. Such an extraordinarily generous deal was given to Australia at Kyoto in 1997 that Australia had nothing to do. Duncan Kerr, who was Labor's environment spokesperson at the time, so in opposition, he said that Australia had been given a 3-inch putt. And that's why we've got this 4% carryover. The rest of the world described the Australian deal as a disgrace. So that's why it's 19%. But just as importantly as the 2020 target, the authority said Australia should adopt a 2030 target as well, because a short-term target, particularly if it doesn't carry much weight, doesn't really embody the long-term commitment of decarbonising the Australian economy. So the authority recommended that Australia should aim to reduce its emissions by 40 to 60% by 2030, which is actually quite a serious effort given that the EU's target is to reduce the EU emissions by 40% by 2030. So we recommended that Australia should go further than the EU. Mind you, Australia has a lot more to do because of its historical responsibility than the EU. By making a serious commitment to a 2030 target, Australia would finally be setting itself on a credible path to realising its pledge to play its part in global efforts to limit warming to 2 degrees. In the absence of an effective policy, by 2020 Australia's emissions would be 17% higher than they were in 2000. So aiming for a 19% reduction instead of a 17% increase under business as usual, a 19% reduction on 2000 levels by 2020 is a serious and considerable task, but one which the authority, after examining emission reduction opportunities, deemed to be one that could be achieved at modest cost. So the point of this is that our 5% target for 2020 is simply not a credible target to adopt. It's the target that the Abbott government has said it's still committed to. The Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop, said the other day that reducing Australia's emissions by 5% is an ambitious goal. In fact, a 5% target means that Australia is either asking the rest of the world, including poor countries, to shoulder some of Australia's burden, or we are putting ourselves in a situation, by going slowly for the next few years, where we would have to undertake impossibly steep emission cuts after 2020. In fact, through to 2030, we would have to halve Australia's emissions in 10 years. To stick within our budget, we'd have to halve Australians' emissions. That is historically unknown, to reduce any country's greenhouse gas emissions by that level, at that rate. The third alternative, of course, is that by adopting a 5% target, the government has abandoned the 2 degrees goal and has committed Australia and the rest of the world to living in a hot and dangerous world effectively forever. That's what the 5% target means. Let me finish on a final point, and that is that it's often said by the mining industry and by the Murdoch press that sharp cuts to Australians' greenhouse gas emissions to reach a budget constraint such as the one recommended by the authority would be economically ruinous. Well, the authority, the Climate Change Authority, commissioned modelling from the Treasury, not usually known as a radical organisation, which showed that the cost of moving from a 5% emission reduction target by 2020 to a 19% emission reduction target in 2020 would be modest, to say the least. Here are the figures. It's estimated that adopting the stronger target, that is 19%, would reduce the growth rate of gross national income per Australian, per capita, from 0.8% a year to 0.78% a year. Put another way, with a 5% target, you can see from here, if you can get your binoculars out, you can see the difference between a 5% target and a 19% target. With a 5% target, gross national income per person is expected to grow from $62,350 a year or two ago to $66,450. With a 19% target, this economically ruinous emission reduction objective, gross national income would not grow to $66,450, it would only grow to $66,350. A shortfall that would be made up in 3 months. So, for the average Australian, the economic effect of a 19% target, according to Treasury modelling, instead of a 5% target, would be waiting an extra 3 months before their income reached the same level. Seems to me that a $100 drop in gross national income per person by 2020 would be a trifling sacrifice if that's all it would take for Australia to make a credible contribution to saving the world from catastrophe. Australia's 5% target is not ambitious, it's a denial that climate change is a threat. A 5% target is in fact a recipe for climatic disaster, accepting that the world could reach a warming of 3, 4, 5 degrees and beyond. A 5% target is a target that I believe, and the authorities' analysis suggests, would wreck Australia's future. Thank you.
Okay, Ian Dunlop is up next, and he's going to add another dimension to this. He's going to consider the growth implications of carbon budgets, but he's also going to talk a little bit about declining energy return on investment.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeremy, for the invitation to. Pardon me. There we go. Speak to you this morning. What sort of economic growth is permissible in a climate-constrained world? Well, I'd like to build on the points that both Jean and Clive have already mentioned, because to me it depends very much on what you think the size of the problem really is. If you look at where we've come from, growth, as we've known it in conventional terms, is totally dependent on cheap fossil fuels. That's essentially what's happened since the Industrial Revolution. And with that, we've produced the amount of carbon emissions you see in the slide. Conventional growth, of course, relates to GDP primarily. But if you actually look at other measures of growth, such as the Genuine Progress Indicator, growth actually stopped around about 1970, and it's leveled off and it's gradually declined ever since. So by continuing to consume ever-increasing amounts of fossil fuel, we have actually seen a decline in the quality of life. That's not something that actually comes to the fore, I think, in the national discourse that we currently have. Those carbon emissions, of course, are now becoming a problem. If you look at the climate implications and where they're taking us. And my concern is that effectively we are underestimating the size of the problem that we're currently dealing with. The work of the IPCC is extremely important. It's the bedrock, if you like, of where we're going on the whole question of climate issue and the response to it. But as Jean said, I think in the last slide, the IPCC is inherently conservative because of the process it actually goes through. It's basically confirming and reinforcing, I guess, the science that's been developed over a long period. It is a global consensus. And in my view, you really do have to move beyond the science to actually look at the risk management implications of what we are being told, particularly in the context of the non-linear positive feedback points, the tipping points that Clive's referred to. Because those are the so-called fat tail risks. These are the big, high impact and what were thought to be relatively low probability risks which we're dealing with. Now, if you look at the way that the IPCC represents essentially the carbon budget that we can consume, which I think Clive's referred to, you can come up with a full probability distribution which looks something like the blue curve in the slide here, where essentially you've got, screen's smaller than I'm used to, but you've got the emissions quota or budget on the vertical axis and the probability of success in keeping below 2 degrees C on the horizontal axis. So if you look at the emissions that we've put out so far, you get the grey bar you can see on the slide. If you then look at, say, a 33% chance of success of keeping below 2 degrees C, you get that green line. And that gives you the line going out to about 1,200 petajoules of carbon, I think, petagrams of carbon, sorry, on the left-hand side. Now, if you increase the chance of success, sorry, that's the budget you can then afford to emit above what we have already emitted since the Industrial Revolution, the green arrow. If you increase the chance to 50%, then the budget drops off. And if you increase the chance to 66%, I think the figure that roughly Clive was talking about, then you see the red line. But I think as Clive said, I mean, a 66% chance of staying below 2 degrees C, which people consider to be the limit of dangerous climate change, is actually not really very good odds, particularly when you think that the implication of that is probably a very substantial reduction in population worldwide. If you take that up to a more realistic level, in my view, in a risk management sense, which might be, say, 90% chance, then you actually have no budget left at all. And I believe that is actually the point we're looking at today, because if you look around the world, the non-linear responses of the climate system are starting to kick in areas like the Arctic, the Antarctic, ocean acidification, and so on. Now, this is stuff that is in the IPCC reports, but it's not quantified in most cases because we just don't have enough information available. And that's why I believe that in a risk management sense, we have to go beyond the science and start to look at the implications of that. Because if you're in a position of high uncertainty, which is what we are, you actually have to take greater precautions than if you had a much better handle on it from a strictly scientific point of view. So I think the problem is actually considerably greater than we're being told, and it needs a far more rapid response than we have been seeing officially around the world at this point in time. Now, if you then move on to the questions of the alternatives, well, the low-carbon alternatives are basically challenging. This is a picture of the so-called energy return on energy investment. If you go exploring for energy or trying to produce energy, you have to put a certain amount in to get it out. You have to drill your oil wells, you have to dig your coal mines, you have to set up transportation systems. And the bottom axis here, the horizontal axis, shows the ratio between the amount of energy you get out compared with the energy you put in. And the green area is the area that's available for society to operate. The red area is the energy you've got to put in to get that energy out. So you can see that the ratio over time, moving from left to right, is from 50 down to 0. If you were in the heyday of the oil industry, back in the 1930s and 40s in the Middle East, the ratio was about 100 to 1. It was a very good deal, so you kept on doing it. Over time, we've essentially found the sweet spots in the oil reservoirs around the world, and the difficulty of getting oil out is increasing. As you can see, we're going into deeper and deeper water, further and further offshore. There's now talk of going into the Arctic, and so on. The ratio today has changed from, say, around 100 to 1 pre-war to something like 20 to 1 at the present time. And the newer technologies that are coming in all tend to be toward the right-hand side of the diagram, with much lower energy returns on investment than we've seen historically. Tar sands, for example, around about 3 to 1. Corn ethanol might be down 1.3 to 1. Biofuel, 1.7 to 1. If you look at nuclear and wind, it's around the 10 or 12 mark. If you look at shale oil and shale gas, it's a bit below that. The problem is that to run an industrial society in the way we've known it, you actually need a ratio of around 10 to 1. That's the excess that runs the system, that drives the buses, that builds the cities, keeps the aircraft flying, and so on. Once your energy sources actually start dropping to below 10 to 1, then you cannot really maintain the industrial society in the way that we've known it, unless you take other major steps to change behavioral change and so on. So if we're now at the point where fossil fuels we cannot use because of the climate problem, and we have to move to alternatives, the energy return on investment is dropping. Inevitably, it's going to mean fundamental changes to the way the economic system actually works and what we actually term economic growth. We're going to have to make choices, and this is an example of the hierarchy of energetic needs. If you can see, moving from the bottom up, you start extracting energy. I'm not sure if this is clear enough at the top. And you might have an energy return on investment from doing that of about 1.1 to 1. If you then refine it, you need a higher energy return on investment to pay for that. So it goes up to 1.2 to 1, transporting it 3 to 1, growing food 5 to 1, going up to families, supports and so on, 7 or 8 to 1. Healthcare, you have to go up to a 12 to 1 level. And so you go up through the hierarchy, and essentially to achieve that, you have to have this energy surplus available. Now, the quantification of that, the blue colours are pretty well defined. Once you get higher in the hierarchy, it becomes more difficult, which is the yellow area. So we're going to have to think very carefully about how we run society, what is really important and what isn't, if we are now going to be constrained in terms of energy availability. Those decisions, in my view, are going to have to be made far more quickly than anybody is talking about in any official context, both here and globally. Because it's not a question any longer of incremental change. We are going to have to change extremely quickly if we want to prevent the worst impacts of climate change and to maintain some semblance of societal stability in the process of doing it. So we need to make these decisions very quickly because the resilience of our system is actually declining. The G20 agenda that you may well have been looking at, I think, on the tables, makes a big point about the fact we need growth and we need resilience. Well, I believe the situation we're in at the moment is actually an extremely dangerous one because if you look at the way in which the economic system has operated since the end of World War II, it's actually been very effective. I mean, we've seen growth in organizations. You have systemic breakdown because those organizations either become outdated and new technologies come in. You have a systemic breakdown, reorganization, regrowth, and so on. The process has moved, and it's been, in many respects very effective in developing the levels of wealth we currently have. The problem at the moment is we've lost track of the fact that the high carbon implications mean that we cannot keep doing that. And we've actually moved out on this overextended high carbon growth track, not just here, but also around the world. The implication of that is that if we keep on doing it, we use up the resources we've got available to actually make the transition to a low carbon economy, and we don't have the resilience available to then do it. Now, I believe that we are actually where that red dot is, past the sensible point of systemic reorganization and moving well into overextended growth terms. And that means that we do run the risk of, in fact, running into a collapse situation unless we start to recognize this and change the approach we're using very quickly. And there's no sign of that, I have to say, in the G20 agenda, unfortunately. The other dimension to that, of course, is the famous statement by Upton Sinclair that it's very difficult to get a man to understand something if his salary depends on him not understanding it. And that is the problem of the vested interests, I think, that are locked into the high carbon world in which we're currently living. So, finally, we have enough fossil fuels to cook this planet several times over, and many, I think, in our society would have us use them all up. If we are intent on seriously addressing this problem, we really are going to have to move to an emergency response, a completely different paradigm from the one in which the debate is currently going on. And I think the final word I just leave to Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Centre in the UK, who just makes the point that we face an unavoidably radical future. We either continue with rising emissions and reap the radical repercussions of severe climate change, or we acknowledge that we have a choice and pursue the radical emission reductions. There isn't any longer a non-radical option. Moreover, the low-carbon supply technologies cannot deliver the necessary rate of emissions reduction. They need to be complemented with rapid, deep, and early reductions in energy consumption. Now, that doesn't mean sackcloth and ashes. It actually is an enormous opportunity because it means we have to reorganize the system into a much more efficient and sensible, sustainable basis. And that, in my view, is where the growth opportunities really lie. But it is a redefinition of the way in which we actually look at growth. Thanks very much.
Okay, so bring the mic down for us height-challenged people. Let's bring Brian Czech to the stage now. And given what's gone previous, it's probably a good opportunity for Brian to talk about the alternatives to economic growth as it's traditionally defined, and maybe clear up a little bit of confusion in terms of what degrowth, green growth, no growth, choose your prefix for growth.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. It's going to be hard to be bleaker than those last few talks, but I'll try. So I kind of retooled the subtitle of Supply Shock here for the panel's the purpose of this panel, you know, to talk about the terminology a little bit, which is really important for, you know, progress in terms of sustainability. Let's see here. Okay. So, you know, the economy, if you look around you, you can see what it is on the ground, you know, the pivot agriculture in Saudi Arabia in this case, and you go around the world and you see the agricultural and extractive sectors on the ground becoming, you know, pretty unsustainable in a lot of different ways. You know, the mining, the livestock, and all the way up to the information sectors. And of course the infrastructure and the energy sectors, which is maybe the key one for this panel so far. And, you know, and then the end of the tailpipe, if you will. So these are pretty dramatic ways of exemplifying these sectors and structures of the economy, but that's kind of what it is. That's the economy on the ground, right? So it's going to be hard to imagine retooling that kind of stuff enough to avoid a real train wreck. But whenever we talk about this, I think it's often been missing in the discussion, and it's one of the reasons we got to this nasty point that we're at, because this wasn't talked about enough when we talked about the relationship between economic growth and environmental protection. You know, we just kind of let it slide what economic growth really meant. So going forward, I think we have to remind our audience and discussants and the G20 in this case, exactly what it is. You know, it's simply increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate, and that's a key phrase. And so it's typically expressed in terms of GDP, and which makes it pretty evident that it entails increasing population and or per capita production and consumption. But this phrase, as I say, is really key, and another thing that has gotten overlooked a lot. So we'll bring in the old metaphor of the 800-pound gorilla. You know, in my day job, I worked for the U.S. government, and there's no way we could have a conference like this there with that government involved. I don't know about yours. But so we kind of treat it like the 800-pound gorilla, or the elephant in the room, if you prefer. I kind of like to use the 800-pound gorilla because it's, you know, it's got the two arms, the population and per capita consumption. And this time we're going to get it out of the corner and watch it grow. So see, that's economic growth. It's increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. That's not economic growth. So a lot of times you might hear, well, you know, we can grow the renewable energy sector while we shrink the fossil fuel sector, and it'll be okay. You know, we can reconcile economic growth with climate stability or environmental protection in general. But that, you know, that's not economic growth. That's like a sectoral readjustment. It may or may not be accompanied by economic growth, but economic growth, at least in, you know, the most standard definition, the textbook definition and policy relevant and publicly resonant definition, it's just more and more stuff being produced and consumed by more and more people. So that's economic growth. And it helps for us in thinking about sustainability, which goes, of course, far beyond climate change. And that's one thing I think that we should probably try to get at with this panel is, even if we got that problem solved, which evidently is not even, you know, close to being in the cards for a while, we had all kinds of environmental problems prior to climate change even becoming a known problem. And so it's really time that we get at the goal itself, the macroeconomic policy goal. And, you know, it helps to keep in mind that in order to have economic growth, and yeah, there's a circular flow of money involved, but you can't get it without the use of the natural capital stocks and the funds of ecosystem services that give you the product, allowing for the consumption and the GDP growth, and you can't do that without having some waste. Those are laws of thermodynamics. The second law in particular, you have to have some degree of waste. You can't get a 100% efficient, and much less get more than 100% efficient. That would be violating the first law of thermodynamics as well. So you can't get something from nothing, and if you were to try to get 100% efficient, it would slow you down such that it would take forever, literally, for that to happen. So, you know, therefore, it's also kind of fluffy talk to think about we're just going to keep getting more and more efficient. Certainly if there's any element of capitalism involved, or really any competition, any element of a competitive economy, socialist, capitalist, kingdom, whatever, you're not going to select for anywhere near 100% efficiency. You wind up selecting more toward the middle of the spectrum where you can get things done rapidly and produce a lot. It's related to a thing in physics called the maximum power principle. But so we have the standard textbook policy relevant, publicly resonant definition of economic growth in mind. I think what Ian was getting at, and it's a good thing to keep in mind also, is that technically, in a different technical sense, and maybe more importantly in a rhetorical sense, after a certain point, more growth of GDP isn't really economic after all, in the sense that it's starting to cause more problems than it solves. And that clearly is the case with pulling out all the stops for GDP growth when you're in a, 85% fossil fueled economy. Certainly in terms of the GDPs marketed around the world. So by all evidence of climate stability, we're already beyond the stage of optimal scale, which is where marginal utility and marginal disutility are equal. And I see I'm beyond my 7 minutes time 12 seconds ago. We put the little timer on here. So green growth, in our opinion, it's an oxymoron. Our at APCSE, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. You can't have it, and I think we can probably get more into why you can have that, but maybe it's already pretty evident empirically that you won't have that. And then degrowth is the opposite of growth. That's growth, that's degrowth, and that's the steady state economy, which when you think about it, is the only sustainable alternative in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. We're running a little bit behind time, but I do want to squeeze a couple of questions in. I'd like to ask Richard Sanders, first of all, to ask your question. I hope you've got it ready. Maybe just focus on the last sentence, which I think would get the panel to... Yes, Richard. Have you got a microphone for Richard, please? Yes, the last sentence, so I think just succinctly.
Does the panel accept that we actually need to move into degrowth, to move towards a slightly less than one planet economy, given we are currently at a 1.6 planet economy? That's to each member of the panel. Thank you.
Do you want to start off, Clive?
Well, I wrote the book, or one of the books, on the problems of growth fetish some 10 years ago. So, Richard, that I've a very trenchant critic of growth for growth's sake. I often, I used to say when I used to talk about this stuff that I am not opposed to growth as such. I'm opposed to the fetishization of growth. And I look forward one day to a time when in the federal government, in the Canberra bureaucracy, Treasury was not the number one ranked government department, perhaps, but maybe the sort of sixth or seventh. And, at the top we'd have education and public health and other areas of life that contribute to well-being. But I think it's important to stress that whilst growth is very much the obsession with growth and the endless desire to keep expanding, which is reproduced in every newspaper and by every politician every day, every hour of every day, is absolutely at the source of the problem. Even so, I think there's an enormous amount that can be done by pursuing the kinds of strategies or the kinds of analysis that I kind of outlined. That an enormous amount can be done to reducing Australia's greenhouse gas emissions and the world's over the next 10 or 15 years to set us on the path. And where we go after that is something that, I think the urgent thing is to get to that peak year and turn down as rapidly as we can.
Well, I'll just say yes. Yeah, technically, we need a phase of degrowth, and then at some point, you would have to replace that with a steady state economy to be sustainable, because, you know, ultimately degrowth is no more sustainable than growth, right? And just as horrible as uneconomic growth can get. And rhetorically or politically, I would say maybe we need to be cautious right at the moment, at this point in history, and consider whether or not we can handle more than one paradigm shift at a time. So if we're going to talk about degrowth, I think we have to really clarify that we're talking about the movement towards steady state economies nationally in terms of the global economy as the long run goal, and ideally at optimal scale.
Gene?
I don't have much to say about this. I mean, I think it's so unlikely to happen that maybe we need to look at other possibilities. I think we have to learn how to take carbon out of the environment if we possibly can, and to store it somewhere safely. There is technology around that. Technology can mean wealth, but I would like to certainly see a steady state economy, but I don't see how we're going to get there.
Ian?
Well, in a sense, we're already there. I mean, if you look at what's happened since the GFC in 2008, everybody's been trying to reboot the economy onto the same basis we've been going since the end of World War II, and it's not working. I mean, with all the quantitative easing, or whatever we call it, I think these days, all the money that's being thrown at the system, we actually haven't seen growth restarted. And if you actually look at the problem, a large part of the issue is, in fact, the high cost of energy. I mean, as long as oil prices stay up around $100 a barrel, which they've been doing, then you're not going to get a reactivation of growth as we basically know it. And there's no sign of that sort of changing anytime soon. The bigger problem, in a way, is that those high oil prices are now led to major investment in very expensive projects on the assumption that high oil prices will actually remain. And the energy return on investment coming out of those is actually dropping. So if you look at the oil majors, they've been spending capital hand over fist, but the actual production performance of those same companies is actually dropping. So we are at a major discontinuity, in my view, right now. And that is obviously compounded by the speed with which climate change is actually happening. So you have this convergence, I think, of both the climate and the energy problem, which is manifesting itself in a whole range of ways around the world. I mean, a lot of the problems, for example, in the Middle East, stem from climate change and energy interfaces, because of the way in which the drought in those parts of the world has actually been at an all-time record for many, many years now, which means the economies of those countries cannot operate in the way they used to. So we're already starting to see some of these things play out. I'm not saying that's the only reason, but underneath it, there is quite a fundamental impact happening because of these things already. So I think, in short, we are moving to a form of degrowth already, and hopefully it will move into a preparedness to think about what a steady state economy really means. But I think essentially, as Brian says, I mean, degrowth is not something that can go on for an extended period, at least you hope it won't, because it's going to be rather chaotic if it does.
Thanks, Ian. Can I just ask the tech people to get ready, don't show it just now, but get ready the video question from Steve Killerley, please. And can I ask Judith McNeil from the University of New England to ask her question, and maybe just read the last paragraph, Judith?
You're going to restrict me to the last sentence again. So just a very quick explanation that this question was prompted by a headline in the Australian newspaper when the last APCSE came out, which said that the costs of fighting climate change by 2100 would be X billion dollars, where X was a very high figure. there was nothing in the report about the benefits of fighting climate change. So my worry was, why are they relaxed about this? And I thought, well, the economic models, which have been quite influential, do assume that GDP will be much, much higher by 2050 and in fact 2100. And these models have been influential. So, getting to the point, sorry. Won't that economic growth as measured by GDP in reality contain a high proportion of adaptation spending, that is, ever replacing assets and strengthening assets, kicking ever harder just to keep our heads above water? Thank you.
Clive Hamilton.
Well, yeah, I mean, I despair as a former economist myself at the way in which economists, most economists, not all, and policymakers assume that this is just another cost-benefit question. That, you know, we look at what the kind of costs of global warming will be, and we work out the cost of reducing emissions, and then we, you know, set the global thermostat at the level which will maximise human well-being. I mean, to me, this is a kind of form of insanity. Partly because you only need to look at the IPCC reports, bearing in mind that they tend to be excessively cautious, to recognise that if any one of the dramatic changes, the crossings of the tipping points occurs, we're in a completely different world, where, you know, cost-benefit analysis becomes laughable. And yet, all of these potentially catastrophic changes of the kind of collapse that Ian has mentioned are kind of rammed into this accounting tool. And to me, it's such a complete failure of intellect that it astonishes me. And so you're quite right, Judith, to ask, well, why do people who are apparently rational creatures do this thing? I'll leave that to others to answer.
I think that's called the flick pass, Brian.
Well, so all these, you're referring to defensive expenditures, mitigative expenditures, which seem to be mounting with GDP, and it's all just an indicator of the size of the economy going past optimal scale, where marginal utility of growth is exceeded by the marginal disutility of growth. And I kind of agree, it's a lot of nonsense involved in the actual calculation and accounting for that. It's more like a matter of common sense. In a democracy, as they might say in poli-sci, you have to muddle toward optimality. There's no good way to measure it, like you might be able to do with an individual firm about producing a particular good. So I think that things like, for example, where I'm from, the Endangered Species Act is a response to, excessive economic growth, and the polity has to muddle toward enforcing that to the level that's required to, ratchet back the rate of growth toward a steady state economy, as well as a whole bunch of other types of environmental regulations, among other kinds of, regulations. And then one last thing, it's not just a matter of public policy with things like conferences like this and books and, the media hopefully getting more behind this. The propensity to consume, as we say, will be lowered, and theoretically you could establish a steady state economy without any policies, although certainly there are some institutions that wouldn't fit well with a steady state economy, like fractional reserve banking, for example. But the point is, it's both a public policy issue and private sector behavior that's required.
Jean, these integrated assessment models in the IPCC.
Sorry?
The integrated assessment models that the economists produce in Working Group 3, they're quite influential, aren't they?
Well, they are. That actually wasn't what I was going to refer to. They are, and they come up with figures of sort of 1 or 2% of GDP. That's right. I don't know how much credence you can put on those numbers. What I do know is that there's a lot of effort going on in the background of the IPCC to actually come up with better numbers for those integrated assessment models. I was actually going to reflect a little bit on the process of the multilateral negotiations that take place under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I mean, one of the things is, which may be a good thing or a bad thing, or neither of those, is that it's one country, one vote. And so a lot of the countries that participate in the Framework Convention are developing countries who really make very little contribution towards greenhouse gas emissions, but nevertheless need to be on side in the negotiations if anything is to be achieved at all. So from their perspective, the problem is not one of mitigation and greenhouse gas emissions reduction, it's one of adaptation. And there needs to be a transfer of money and funds from developed countries to developing countries to allow those countries to adapt, and essentially to allow those framework convention negotiations to go forward, because if they don't get the money to adapt, essentially they're going to walk away from the table. And that costs money, and at the moment the Green Climate Fund, which is set up in order to transfer those funds and to allow that adaptation to take place, is seeking $1 billion per year in order to allow that adaptation to take place. I thought I'd just put that into the mix.
Thank you, Jane. Quick comment, please, Ian.
Yeah, look, I think, to me, there's a real problem in the way in which we look at these issues via conventional economics and economic modelling. I think it, in the end, comes back to this question of risk management, because this is a problem unlike any we've ever experienced before. It's not something which you can handle by incremental change. This is an existential issue which may see major reductions in global population if we just allow the thing to unfold in a conventional sense. So you are going to have to move to a completely different sort of response to essentially handle it. And I think you have to look at it in terms of how do you manage really potentially catastrophic risk. The answer to that, I believe, is that you really have to move to a normative approach where you essentially say, look, we're going to get to the point where we recognize this is a much, much bigger problem than anybody expected. We are then going to have to say, well, look, these are the targets we have to hit in terms of emission reductions. And the question is not then a matter of what is politically realistic. It's really a matter of saying, well, we're here today, we've got to get there tomorrow, how are we going to do it? Now, I don't know what point we're going to reach that, but I think we will get to that stage at some point, probably sooner rather than later. And I think the economic approach to this really ought to be rethought in terms of how you put that sort of normative approach into a more realistic economic context. And we're certainly not doing that at the moment.
It's 1:17, which means that we're now 2 minutes into lunchtime, and I'm told, reliably informed, we have hot food outside, yes? So the longer we stay in here, the colder it's going to get. I think the best strategy now is to pin these guys, these people down when they're eating their lunch and ask them difficult questions. Or at least tweet them. Clive's got his Twitter account, so you can tweet him, let him eat his lunch. The rest of them, you can interrogate them. Can you give him a big hand, please? And we'll save the video question maybe for one of the sessions this afternoon. Thank you.
I love that line of yours. Can we handle more than one crowd?